Hello everyone, welcome to the last lesson for Python for Beginners course. In this lesson, we are going to look at functions. So we will cover creating and calling functions, parameters and arguments, and also variable scope. A function is simply a reusable block of code that performs a specific task. With functions, we are able to avoid repetition of code, which is very important in programming. It makes our programs easier to maintain. It also helps us to write easy to read programs, and it helps us to build modular programs. So this means that we can easily package parts of a code in one program and then use it in another program. Let's look at the syntax for creating functions. Now for functions, we use the def keyword. So we have def and then the function name, and then we have into brackets parameters, which we'll come to later. And inside the function, we have our code block. So after creating a function, we need to call it in any part of our code for it to perform a specific task. So we simply use the name of the function and parentheses to call the function. So this is the basic syntax for calling a function. Now we are going to introduce parameters and arguments. A parameter is simply a variable that receives values when the function is called. We'll take a look at the example here. We have def greet into brackets name. So in here, the name is 7 as a parameter. The name here is 7 as a variable where we are going to pass in values whenever we call the function. Arguments are the values that are passed to parameters. So in this example, when we're calling a function, greet into brackets, Emma here is the argument, and we are passing it to the name, which is the parameter. The function is going to use the value that has been passed to the parameter to perform the specific action, which is we are trying to display good morning and the value passed to name. It is very important to know the difference between a parameter and an argument. In this example, we have created a function called calculate grade, and for parameters we are using name and score. For the code block, we are saying if the score is greater or equal to 80, it is grade A. If the score is greater or equal to 70, it is grade B. If the score is greater or equal to 60, it is grade C. And any value outside what we have specified is grade F. We are going to display name, which will then show the value that we have passed to this parameter. We are also going to display the string scored. We are also going to display the value which has been passed to the parameter score, and then followed by and got grade as a string, and then finally we show the grade value, which will be determined by the condition check, that is if, elif, and else. For the second part, we are simply calling the function 3 different times. So we are calling the first function with the argument Bella as the name and 85 as the score. For the second one, we are calling the function with the argument Chris as the name and 72 as the score. And for the last one, we are calling the function with Kwame as the name argument and 55 as the score argument. So now let's run this code and see what happens. For the output, Bella scored 85 and got grade A, which is coming from the fact that 85 is greater than 80. Chris scored 72 and got grade B because 72 is greater than 70, and so it's showing grade B. And Kwame had 55, and so it's showing grade F. Let's look at the different types of function arguments. The first one is a default argument. For the default argument, the parameter is already preset with a value, so that if you are calling the function with no argument, the value passed to the parameter when we created the function would be used. We also have keyword arguments. For keyword arguments, whenever we are calling a function, we use the name and value pair so that we can specify which parameter gets which value. So for positional arguments, whenever we are calling the functions, the arguments are assigned to the parameter. If you have 5 parameters and we have 5 arguments, the first argument will be passed to the first parameter, the second argument will be passed to the second parameter, and so on. The last type of argument is called arbitrary arguments. So we have args and we have quarks. So these are special types of arguments whenever we want to accept an unknown number of arguments. So the first one, we have args. With the args, we can accept any number of positional arguments. And then with the quarks, we can accept any number of keyword arguments. So we will look at an example of each of them to understand better. For the first part of this example, we have default arguments. We have created a function called greet. So we have def greet, and then we are giving a default value to the name parameter, which is guest. The code block, we have print hello and then name. So it means that we are going to display hello and then the value which is passed to the name parameter. We are calling the function with an argument here, Alice. And in the second part, on the next line, we are calling a function with no argument. So we run this code and we see the differences. For the second part, you're looking at keyword arguments. So we've created a new function called students underscore info, and we are using the parameters name and age. For the code block, we want to simply display the name as a string and then the value which is passed to the name parameter. We also want to display age as a string and also the value which is passed to the age parameter. On line 16, we are calling the function which is students info into brackets age is equal to 20. So here we are using key value pairs to call the function. So we have age, which is 20, and then we have name, which is Samuel. So for the keyword arguments, it means that we can place the arguments and the parameters at any position, because whenever we are calling a function, we are going to specify which argument is passed to which parameter. For the next part, we are looking at positional arguments. So this is quite the opposite of keyword arguments. So here we've created a new function called introduce, and we are using the parameters name and country. For the code block, we simply want to display the value which is passed to the name parameter, and then string is from. And the last part, which is the value that is passed to the country parameter. On line 24, we are calling a function with Alice and Canada. But notice that with this part, Alice is going to be passed to the name parameter because both of them are in the first position, and Canada is going to be passed to the country because both of them are in the second position. The quarks is mostly useful if we do not know the number of arguments that are going to be accepted anytime you call the function. So here we've created a new function called display info. So notice here we are not defining any parameter because we do not know the number of parameters or arguments that are going to be used here. So in the code block, we have for key and value. So key and value here are the items that we are using for the for loop. So for key and value in quarks dot item. So here it means that we should take the keys and values and store them in their respective items. We're also going to display them as key, a colon, and value. So here we call the function display underscore info. Then we have name equal to Alice. Then we have age equal to 25 and country equal to Canada. What this code block is going to do is to simply take the name and then store it as a key, take the Alice and store it as a value, and then we are going to display them. Then it moves on to the age and 25, and it moves on to the country and Canada. For the last part, we are looking at args. So args allows us to accept any number of positional arguments. So what you have to take note here is positional argument. So whilst quarks help us to accept any number of keyword arguments, the args allows us to accept any number of positional arguments. So here we've created a new function called add numbers, and for the code block we have set the variable to 0, and then we are using the for loop. So here we said for num in args. So here the num is the item. We are using total is equal to total plus num, and then we are going to display the sum and the value in total. So here we are saying that any number of value which is being passed to the function whenever it is being called, the for loop will iterate through the arguments and then pick each of them, store them as an item in the num variable, and then perform the operation on it, which is adding it to the total and also displaying the final value which is stored in total. Let's run this code and then go through the results. With the results, let's look at the first part, which was the default argument. So you can see the first part we have hello Alice, and then the second part we have hello guest. So it displayed hello Alice because we passed Alice as an argument. The second part, we did not pass any argument. So it passed the value that we set to name, which was guest, as the default argument. For the next part, which is the keyword argument, it displays name as Samuel and age as 20, just as we assigned them when we were calling the function. With the third part, with the positional argument, we see the result as Alice is from Canada. So the Alice was passed to the name, and then Canada was passed to the country based on their order. For the fourth part, which is the quarks, we can now see name as Alice, age as 25, and country as Canada. So we did not have to specify the parameters when we were creating the function. And you can see the results also having the key value pair. Now let's look at the last part, which is the args. So with args, we passed 3, 5, 7, and 10 to it. The for loop iterated over the values that we passed as arguments and then combined all of them. And so we are having sum is equal to 25. The return keyword is used inside the function to send results back to the caller. So here, the caller simply means the code that we write whenever we are calling the function. So for this example, the caller is simply the add into brackets 53 because that's the code that we use to call the function. The return value is the value that the function sends back after executing whatever is inside the code block. With the example here, we've created a new function called add, and then we've used the parameters a and b. Inside the function, we've created a variable where we want to add the values passed to a and b, and then we are going to return the results value. For the next part, we've created a new variable outside the function called sum_value. And here we are using the caller, which is add 5 and 3. So 5 and 3 here are the arguments. And so these values are going to be passed to the parameters. And then the function is going to execute results equal to a plus b, and then send the results back to the caller, which is the add into bracket 53. So here we are going to store it in sum_value. For the last part, we are going to display sum_value. We have a similar example to what we looked at previously, but here we are using the multiplication instead of the addition, and then we are passing 15 and 6 as the argument. Let's run this code and see what happens. For the results, we are seeing 90. So here 15 and 6 as the arguments were passed to the parameters a and b, and then the function multiplied them with results is equal to a times b, and then sends the value back to the caller. The value, which is 90, was stored in sum_value. Let's look at the last part, which is variable scope. A scope simply determines where a variable can be used in the program. So we have local and we have global variables. For local variables, they can be defined and used only inside a function. And for global variables, they can be defined and also used both inside and outside functions. So let's take a look at some examples. In this example, we are looking at a local variable. We've created a function called greet. So we have def greet, and then we've created a variable called message. We have message is equal to hello from inside function. And on the last line, we are displaying whatever is inside the message. And on line 5, we are calling the function. On line 10, you could see that we are trying to display the contents from the variable message, although it's defined inside the function. So let's run the code and see the results. The first part of the results, you could see hello from inside the function. So this is coming from the fact that we've called the function greet into brackets. For line 10, we've gotten an error, which is saying message is not defined. This means that the message variable is a local variable and cannot be used outside the function. For the next example, we are looking at global variables. So we've created a new variable called message, and we've assigned it to a string hello from global scope. On line 3, we've defined a new function, def show_message. And on the next line, we are trying to print whatever is inside the message variable. And so on line 6, we have called the show message function, and on line 10, we are displaying the content from the message variable. So let's run this code and see what happens. From the results, you could see the first part, hello from global scope, is coming from the caller show underscore message. And then the second part is also coming from print into bracket message, which shows that global variables can be used anywhere in the code, whether it's inside the function or outside the function.